Hello.
Hello, G.
Welcome to Alive, my search for the best ways to live. I'm your host. My name is Jigga Jr., and this show is supported by our good friends from Organique Acai. If you want to be healthy and stay healthy this age of the coronavirus, make sure you get the right amount of sleep, 6 to 8 hours a day, the right amount of exercise, 35 an hour a day, of course, the right diet, meaning to say the right amount, and the right kind of food. Make it more vegetables and fruits and a little bit of meat, probably like 20 to 30%. And of course, take your vitamins and supplements. And the best vitamins and supplements that I can recommend for you today, which I've been taking for the past couple of years, is Organique Acai. Grab a bottle or a capsule today, okay? My guest today for Alive is what I call a Kiwi Buano. That's right, a Kiwi Buano. He has been assimilated to the society in which all of us are looking up to these days. They're gaining ground. They're gaining traction. I'm talking about, of course, the country of New Zealand. We're going to get to the bottom of that because actually, to be honest with you, last night a few nights ago, I was trying to imagine why everybody wants either to go or is looking up to New Zealand. And I think I have the perfect resource person since he's been a New Zealander, a Kiwi, and it's been there, in fact, for the past 16 years. My good friend, Raoul Alo.
Hi,
Hi,
Jiggy.
Raoul.
Hi, Jiggy, and hi to your listeners. I hope I can give you some insights into something about New Zealand.
Yes, please. You know, I remember when I was a kid, um, Singapore was the country that we wanted to be. Everybody is looking up to Singapore. But lately, New Zealand has been gaining ground. It's been getting a lot of attention lately. In fact, many Cebuanos like yourself, Raul, have migrated to New Zealand. Tell us, Raul, what is life like in New Zealand? But before that, if you don't mind, I want you to go back 16 years ago in the moment when you decided to move to New Zealand. Of all countries in the world, why New Zealand? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Jiggy, and hi to your listeners. Just a small background where we chose New Zealand. Actually, my wife and I were just about to start our own family at that time, early 2000s. And my wife, Jackie, and I, we talked about where we wanted to move. Now, if you recall, during that time in the early 2000s, a certain trilogy started to come out called The Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
And that was when actually New Zealand really gained popularity as a destination to immigrate. And it became so popular, in fact, that it became very hard to move here because a lot of people started to know that New Zealand is more than just a country of 4 million people and 45 million sheep. That was how people knew it. It's like a very provincial country. They thought that your next door neighbors would be like 5 kilometers away. But we started to dig deeper into New Zealand because I'm a big Lord of the Ring fan. I mean, I really do. And I'm a hopeless. In fact, right behind me, you see Sting. It's like the sword. That's Frodo Baggins' sword. So,
So, without Lord of the Rings, you would not have chosen New Zealand. Is that what you're saying?
probably not. But I had a friend. I had a former colleague from San Miguel who moved here before me, and he told me, and I actually asked him what New Zealand was like because in fact, he was very amused because my questions were like, "Do you guys have basketball courts?" It's like, "What do you think about New Zealand?" Of course we do. so our choice mainly was just try to see if we can find a better opportunities for my son, or because he was very young at that point. And New Zealand became very popular, mainly because of the Lord of the Rings. And
So, did it disappoint? Did it live up to your expectations? Was it better than where you were here in Cebu, right? Because you were in Cebu. You have a job in one of the top corporations in the Philippines, San Miguel. So, was it better than where you were 16 years ago? And was it easy in the beginning, or did it take time for you to, like you said, assimilate?
well,
Those are
it's
three
it's
questions,
hard.
actually. Sorry.
It's hard, Jiggy, because it was hard at the start because the Kiwi culture is quite different from ours. To give you an example, when we moved there, and I think this example will illustrate that point perfectly. When I was interviewed here, it was the day itself that I checked into the hotel. It was game 4 between the Lakers and the Pistons in 2004. So I was very keen to watch it live, right? So when I checked in, I asked the receptionist, which channel is the Lakers playing the Pistons? And this girl had this look on her face that I have no idea what you're talking about.
What's a Piston?
Yeah,
What's a Laker?
so I tried to make it more general. I said, you know, the NBA finals? And she said, I don't know what you're talking about, mate. So I just thought, man, if I'm gonna live here, I have to learn about rugby. I have to learn about cricket. And in fact, that was what the HR manager told me. He said, Raoul, if you want to become a New Zealander, you have to learn about rugby, you have to learn about cricket, and you have to learn how to swear. So, I mean, it's different. And at the start, we found it difficult because our culture is so much, we're much more familiar with the American culture, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
In fact, when I came here, it was the first time that I was told that we Filipinos have an American accent. So I found that very interesting. I always thought the American accent was the normal English. But turns out it was not.
So suffice it to say, in the beginning, you found it difficult to adjust, but eventually you're able to assimilate. You know, there are certain differences, cultural differences, racial differences, geophysical differences, you know, culture, religion, and all those differences that separate sort of one country to another. But
yes.
one of the things that, of course, is similar amongst all nations is there are governments, right? There are leaders that lead a nation.
Yes.
And there are good leaders and there are bad leaders, and there are different forms of government, but it's still, it has a sort of like a hierarchy, a sort of like a form of government. My question is, how much, aside from its beautiful landscape and all that stuff, of course, of New Zealand, how much is it that makes New Zealand tick, is because of their form of government, and also their leader, who's very young and vibrant. In fact, I just heard that she is the first ever leader, prime minister of New Zealand that gave birth. Did she do that in Parliament or something like that? So
yeah.
in the office. So how much is that contributed to how great a nation New Zealand is? Go ahead.
Well, the government, I found it very interesting that the very first things we observed about their government is that their government officials maintain like a high level of integrity. And the moment their integrity is being questioned, so for example, I'll give you a specific case wherein a minister, he was an immigration minister, and he was found to have been giving favors to certain immigrants because they were doing some work for his house. Now, it was just reported. It wasn't even investigated, but because it was substantiated by the reporter that there were facts to back up the report, he did not even wait for an investigation. He just resigned. So they have they put a very high price to the integrity of Parliament. In fact, when my family toured Wellington about a couple of weeks ago during the school holidays, they even told us we cannot touch the chairs because that's reserved for the ministers. So that's how they try to preserve the integrity of their office. It's like, it's not for you, it's just for the government officials. And, you know, on the flip side, they are given very high expectations. And if you have read, I'm not sure if you've been aware of what's been happening here lately. There were a few scandals that have rocked the government here on both sides. And to try to keep that under control, they came up with this, what's called a code of conduct now. That this is expected of you as a minister, that you should behave this way, otherwise you'll be held to account. And it's different. I mean, it's the most interesting part of it for me is that it's something that we can easily replicate in the Philippines if we just put our mind to it.
Jacinda Ardern, I hope I pronounced that correctly, your prime minister, she sat 2 years ago to 2018. How much of that is because of the way she's running things? How much is the sort of the appeal, the greatness that we sort of observe from the outside looking in, is that because of her and her very youthful and vibrant way of governing New Zealand.
From what I've observed, the greatest strength of Prime Minister Jacinda's, um, her greatest strength is she is a very effective communicator. I mean, when this pandemic started, we see her on TV every 1 p.m. It became like our daily soap opera because everyone was glued to the TV, especially when we were on lockdown. And
Yeah.
aside from Netflix, we had Jacinda every 1 p.m. So she communicated very effectively during a very crucial part of the crisis, which was the start. And I believe personally it was very important to get everyone on board. And she did that by just effectively communicating what the government wanted us to do.
In fact, like I was telling you off cam, one of the reasons why she got the global spotlight was because of that massacre in the mosque there. I think it was last year. Uh,
Yes, last
that's
year.
that's when, unfortunately for her and for New Zealand, that's how she got her sort of global attention. Everybody was looking at New Zealand because of something tragic that just happened, and the way she was able to pull together the New Zealanders, the Kiwis, right? That's what you call yourselves, Kiwis, right?
Yeah.
The way she was able to pull together New Zealand was something that was unheard of. Maybe you can explain to us what happened there and how she was able to pull everybody together.
Well, another trait that's in Jacinda that really makes her stand out is she is very empathetic as a leader. So, and you can't fake when
Empathy,
you
right?
empathize with a person. It shows when you're like faking a hug or faking a smile.
Mhm.
But when she showed up in Christchurch after that horrible shooting on the 5th of March last year, sorry, the 15th of March last year, you can just see her sincerity and her empathy for those who were involved. And the whole country just got behind her because it was just, everyone felt like it was an attack on everyone here. People were in tears, even all the way here in Auckland, because we felt like the whole country was under attack. And yeah, it was just an assault on our freedoms and just the multicultural status of New Zealand. That, everyone just started saying this is not us, and there was a lot of Facebook, what do you call those frames that came out? This is not
Mhm.
us, and she communicated that message very well. In fact, I think she was one of the first people who used that phrase, "This is not us." And one of the most striking things that she did was that she refused to name the gunman. And because she said, you're going to try to gain notoriety by doing this, but I'm not going to give you that. I'm not even going to name you. And she got the press on board. Even the press didn't name him for like I think 6 months, a good 6 months. We never knew who he was unless you Googled it and you were really curious.
Definitely
So,
not Raoul Alo, right?
so she kept that a
Okay, so
secret.
she has gained global prominence in the way she dealt with the Christ the Church massacre, and
Mm,
now she is gaining prominence again in the way she is dealing with the
COVID.
pandemic. In fact,
Yeah.
everybody's looking at New Zealand now as one of the best nations, if not the best nation, to almost single-handedly come out of this pandemic. What do you think New Zealand did differently? Maybe uh, you can give us the sort of like the timeline, Raul, if you don't mind. Maybe you can be brief as possible, but just give us
Okay.
the timeline of the way she attacked this pandemic. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll just use my little cheat sheet here.
Go ahead, man. I don't expect you to remember
Yeah.
timelines. I
The
don't know what
memory is not
time
as
it
good
is
as
now.
it used to be. But
Okay.
I mean, in summary, I think for one, we were a bit lucky because we were not among the first countries to get hit with COVID.
Like the Philippines,
Yes, I'm not sure where the Philippines ranked in terms of getting the
March. We had a
mark.
lockdown March.
So we locked down in March, but New Zealand didn't get our first case until, let me see, the 28th of February. That was our first case. But
Patient
the
zero.
response from the government actually came way before that. When they started seeing cases in Spain and in Italy and in Iran, what the scientists here did was that they started to create these models. So they started to track these countries as to how COVID spread in their countries. And so they used these models. And so when we started having cases here in New Zealand, they then used the projections that they were able to create from the countries that got hit with COVID before to convince us. And they said, we need to do this now, or else our projections, our mathematical models are showing that we will have thousands, if not tens of thousands of new cases within weeks. And we'll have thousands of deaths, which is quite scary for Kiwis to hear, really. And that's why she rallied the whole country. In the last week of March, I believe it was the 23rd, she did not even move us because we have 4 levels of lockdown, level 1, 2, 3, 4. But looking at how many cases we had and how fast it was spreading, she didn't even go to level 1 and 2. They just went straight to level 3. And level 3 essentially is partial lockdown with just some essential services open and some restaurants takeaways like fast foods that you just drive through. You can't even eat in the restaurant. They were open. But 4 days after that, in the 27th of March, we just locked down completely as a country. So only essential services were allowed to go out. But she communicated it so effectively that everyone just got on board. And people were actually reporting those who did not follow the rules. And there were just a few of them. And they clearly also outlined what we needed to do, like, we practice social distancing. They defined as well what we were allowed to do. Like, we were allowed to go out of our homes to take walks, because it can drive you nuts if you just stay in your home the whole time. And
Correct.
regardless, even if you're binging on Netflix, there's only so much Netflix can do for you. So fortunately, it happened towards the end of summer. So we had a few spots there, good weather, so we could go out. But they made sure that we practice social distancing. So whenever we went for walks, whenever we come across somebody, they would actually go to the side of the road and we would greet each other like good morning or good afternoon, but from a distance. So people followed the rules because they saw what was happening in countries like Italy and Spain. And so it was a combination, I think, of one, luck, because we were not the first to get hit. So we had a chance to observe, the government had a chance to observe what happened in other countries. And to their credit, they used these models that they created so that they can convince the citizens what we needed to do. And secondly, Jacinda and her team were very effective in communicating to us what we needed to do. They defined the levels of lockdown and the restrictions for each level of lockdown. But, the Kiwis themselves, she refers to us as the team of 5 million. And those, each and every Kiwi really who got behind what she wanted us to do needs to be given credit, because it only takes one rule breaker and this virus will just spread like crazy. In fact, they call them clusters. They were just single cases that, for example, went to a wedding and that whole wedding party got infected with COVID. And there was one particular case where I think it was a flight attendant from New Zealand who attended a St. Patrick's Day because it happened during the lockdown. So he attended a St. Patrick's Day celebration in a bar, and everyone from that bar just became infected. So they also made these incidents news to the public. Like, they told us what happened. And so the public knew that if we're not careful, if we're complacent, this is what's going to happen. So the public just got behind her, and her being a very effective communicator, I think, really helped the country.
So you mentioned earlier that it's her way of communicating that is probably her biggest, her superpower, right? She was able to rally your people behind her in the Christchurch massacre, and now, of course, she's able to rally behind the team of 5 million behind her in destroying this pandemic. You mentioned that she is very clear in the way she communicates. You know,
Yes.
that alone, the assignment of numbers instead of acronyms like what we have here, MECQ, GCQ, I think
Yes.
is a clear example of how effective a communicator she is, because you know you just assign numbers one, two,
Yes.
three, four, so you don't have to memorize all these acronyms, right? And
It's like,
I think I actually posted a video of her, making an announcement. I think this is one of those things that you mentioned. Every 1 p.m. she makes an announcement. The way she communicates is very clear, very simple, and very short. Now, my question here is, being an effective communicator is one thing, but
mm,
having a divided nation is another. How was her uh, rise to power? Was it a sort of a very divided election? Was it a very divided nation? Did she get like only 50% of the nation and all that stuff, or did she get a majority? Did she get a huge number of votes?
huge number of. That's very interesting, Jiggy, because there are two major political parties here: the National Party and the Labor Party. Now, the National Party is more like those who are more business minded, so they're kind of like the Republicans probably in the States. They're more conservative. The Labor Party is more leftist in their policies. And during the elections in 2017, there was the last major elections here. The Labor Party, where Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern belongs to, actually got less votes than the National Party.
Wow.
They got, I believe, 45%, and the National Party, I believe, got 48%. But neither of them had enough votes to form a government. So the way things work here, if you don't have enough seats in parliament to form a government, you then need to form a coalition. So they had to convince a few other parties to side with them so that they can form a government. So Jacinda actually is heading what's called a coalition government. So there's one major party, which is the Labour Party, and then they also had New Zealand First and another party, the Greens, with them. So that's how they formed the government. So she didn't actually have the mandate in terms of the majority vote during the elections. But yeah, crises like the Christchurch shooting just highlighted how good she is as a crisis manager and a communicator. And she just has this aura about her that makes it easier for her, I suppose, to rally people behind her, and especially if she's backed by facts.
So, suffice it to say that uh, number of votes that she didn't quite get during the early stages of the elections. In fact, you mentioned she didn't get the majority, but
No.
of course, there's a way in which the way they elect the officials there, I think she was able to win being a prime minister. Suffice it to say, she's probably more popular now more than ever, more popular than when she first ascended into power, right? Would you be
Yes.
able to say that?
Yes, because the most recent polls, the survey, on in other words, that they did just tonight,
Okay.
the Labour Party was now at 61%.
Okay.
So that's a huge jump, and that means that if the elections were held today, they can then form the government all by themselves. So they don't need anyone else, and that would mean they have the mandate of the people, so to speak. She's very
It
popular.
is.
I mean,
It is true that it is the crises, the challenges that a presidency or a prime ministership faces that sort of defines your position, right? And defined that definitely defined Ardern, right? The crisis
it
that
can,
she had to face, the Christ Church massacre, and now the global pandemic. So where are you now in this pandemic? From what I understand, you've had zero cases for so many days now.
now we had zero cases, uh, regardless of where it came from. There was a point wherein we had zero cases for 22 straight days. And it was at that point wherein people actually were starting to get impatient as to why she was still putting us into a certain lockdown. It was level 3 because businesses needed to reopen. But even though we were having new cases now, all these new cases were actually in the borders. The new arrivals that
Mhm.
they were actually returning New Zealanders who either needed to go back home because they have a sick relative,
Okay.
or they wanted to go back home because things are not going so well where they are. But they need to be quarantined and they then need to be tested. So far, we haven't had any new cases in the community, which is what they wanted to see. So that's why you see rugby stadiums, which can fill up to about 46,000 people. They're full. There's no social.
46,000 people gathering in one sporting event,
Yes,
rugby. And
yes.
are they practicing social distancing, washing of hands, wearing of masks, or no?
No social distancing whatsoever. I mean, just last Friday,
Wow.
I was mentioning to you that we were farewelling a colleague who was moving on to another job, and basically that colleague of ours took us bar hopping, and there was no social distancing there whatsoever.
Wow. Wow.
So
So New Zealand is pretty much back to normal.
in terms of the country itself, the activities of the citizenry, yes. But in terms of along the borders, no. So the borders are still closed to non-New Zealanders. But essentially, the country is functioning quite normally, and the economy is getting back up. Getting back up now because New Zealanders are actually supporting local businesses. It will not be the same, but at least it's not as bad as not having any tourism. So the tourism here is local tourism. There's no international tourism yet. But at least people are going to these tourist spots without having to look behind their shoulders and see if they're. I mean, if you sneeze in public, people will still look at you funny. Put it that way. But I mean, I did that the other day, and the person in front of me looked at me like he was ready to quarantine me. But but other than that, it's quite normal. And I guess it's the result of having 5 weeks of complete lockdown. It was just 5 weeks of people just not going anywhere. We had a
How was the
designated.
enforcement of the lockdown? Was it militaristic? I mean, like, was there military men roaming around the streets of New Zealand? What was the implementation like? How could you enforce a complete lockdown for 5 weeks? How did New Zealand do that?
This is the interesting part, Jiggy. It was later found that there was no law that would have backed the government to arrest people for not following their guidelines, because this is so unprecedented. The COVID-19 crisis is so unprecedented. So even though they were given what they call emergency powers, because they put the country under a state of emergency, which was unprecedented in New Zealand. It only happens on wartime. But even so, the police did not even have the power to arrest people simply because they were flouting the rules. Like, one of the rules was you can't go to a beach which was more than, like, say, 5 kilometers away from where you live. This is to restrict people from moving around the country. But the laws were not in place so that the police can do their jobs supposedly to arrest these people. So the effectiveness of the lockdown was actually a result of Kiwis just following the guidelines that Jacinda gave us. So it wasn't against the law to go against her guidelines. It was just that people saw it as this is what's going to be good for the country. So they just did it. So Nike, just do it, So
I know it's an unfair comparison
mm,
to compare New Zealand to Cebu to the Philippines, right? I mean,
yes,
we are a densely populated nation.
yes,
We are a third world nation. We have a lot of squatters areas, highly dense areas with homes that are just cramped with 10 people living in one household and all that stuff. But there are lessons that we can learn from the New Zealand model, right? And where you are now with 0 cases and a rugby game of 46,000 people watching with no
yes.
pandemic protocols, right? What do you think are the lessons that we can apply here in Cebu, or if not in the entire Philippines, that we can use based on what you have observed over there, the best practices in New Zealand?
Well, one of the main things probably was that during the crisis, at the peak of the crisis at least, there was just one voice that we heard, and so the people, the Kiwis didn't get confused who to follow. So
Who
without
was that?
naming a
Was that
country,
it was Jacinda, right? It was your prime minister.
it was Jacinda. Actually, there were two voices: Jacinda and the director of health, who
Okay.
I think is the next most popular guy in the country right now, Dr.
Okay.
Bloomfield. Now, I believe that was a very effective way of doing it because Jacinda gave the guidelines from the government's perspective.
Okay.
And then here comes Dr. Bloomfield telling us, you know what? If you guys don't follow these rules, this is what's going to happen. You know, Kiwis, you know, this is what's going to happen. So in doing so, we hear that every day. It's kind of like, you know, your teacher's telling you, you know, if you're not going to be good, this is what's going to happen to you. So by doing that every day, Kiwis just got on board, and because just one voice, two voices actually, but one direction, and I think that's very important. And they did not politicize the issue. So she also always says this is some reporters can be quite cheeky, and they ask her, "Do you do know this is an election year and you're hogging the spotlight by appearing on TV every day?" And she just says, "This is not about politics. This is about taking care of New Zealanders." And she's very firm in when she says that, and you can just tell from her sincerity as well. I mean, to be honest with you, Jiggy, I'm not even a Labour Party supporter, but but I really admired how she handled the crisis because she was very sincere. She just said, "This is what we're doing. Politics takes a back seat now because what we're doing now is going to affect all New Zealanders." And that's very important, I believe, in any crisis, especially one as big as this, that there needs to be a single direction and just that one voice that you need to listen to.
So we can learn from that. There should have been just a singular voice, right? It could be just our president. It could be somebody else, but it's just one voice. And I think one of the most important aspects of one voice, it has to be a clear and concise voice. And I think Jacinda's voice is very clear and very concise in the way she explains things. And it's very short and it's very simple. And you remember these things because of because of its simplicity. Um, Aside from having one voice, a clear and a concise voice, I think in terms of the people, right? The culture of New Zealanders. Are New Zealanders how I don't know how to say this because our president just told the world that we're badlungun, we're gaig ulo, we're hard-headed, right? How about New Zealanders? What kind of, generally speaking, what kind of people are the New Zealanders? Kiwis. Do you guys follow rules more than, let's say, the Philippines?
I, I'd say so. I mean, generally speaking, yes. And I'm also quite amused that, when I see our fellow countrymen come over here, it's so easy to give way to pedestrians, to indicate before you change lanes. And I just said, these are the very same people who just do sing it when we are in Cebu. But they follow rules right away. So in general, they are very good at following rules. But I would say they are, for one, they're very laid back people. So they they want their days off. They want to make the most of their days off. And the reason why they love their summers is that straight after work they go to the beaches. I mean, we're surrounded by beaches here. In fact, it's a Friday tradition here, Jiggy, that they are sent home early on Fridays. And they're very laid back, but they also are quick to get behind a particular cause. Like, I am astounded by how it so resonates a particular battle that they had all those years ago in Gallipoli. And when it's something like that resonates with Kiwis, the whole country just gets behind it. And so when Jacinda was able to, unite us to a common goal, the whole country just got behind her. There were a few grumblers in the background, but they were far and few in between.
Would you say that New Zealand and Jacinda is strict? Would that be an appropriate word to describe your society and the way she sort of rules the land? Is she like a strict leader? Would that be a
No,
word to describe her?
I wouldn't say she's strict, but they are very particular about there are some rules that there's just no going around for them, and there are some that it can be up for debate whether it needs to be modified or not, but there are some hard and fast rules that they stick to, and especially if it's something that affects them as a nation, like um, I think that's why the COVID-19 response has been united, if you put it that way, for as far as New Zealanders are concerned, because the main thing that Jacinda told us was that you might not die from COVID-19, but your grandparent might. So think about them before you're reckless and you go to a party and you don't even social distance. Think about those that you might, cause harm. And something like the Kiwis, I found they get behind quite easily. So I guess it's something that's just built up over time because of their experience as a country.
Were there complaints when you were in that 5 week lockdown? Were people sort of scratching their heads and raring to get the hell out of their homes? Were there like pockets of resistance? Were there people who were protesting and all that stuff during the 5 week lockdown? Or was her words gospel and nobody questioned whatever she said?
The first 4 weeks, there was not a single complaint because everyone just thought this is what needed to be done.
Okay.
But when she extended it to a week, then there started to be some people who said, you know what? And especially when we started seeing like zero new cases,
Okay.
and people started to say, you know what? We don't have community outbreaks anymore. Why are you still locking us down? So there were questions along the way. But she also was quite good in turning this around, and she says, you know what? This is an unprecedented crisis. So of
Okay.
course we're gonna make mistakes, but we're gonna listen to you.
Raul, we have a lot of Cebuanos, Filipinos, actually anyone watching this interview who are looking at New Zealand as their role model in the pandemic response. What is your message, especially to your fellow Cebuanos out there who are looking up at New Zealand and the way they're dealing with the pandemic? Go ahead, Raul.
Yes, just another good evening or good morning, depends when my fellow Cebuanos and fellow Filipinos are listening to this podcast. But as much as New Zealand has done so well in its response to the COVID-19, it's a lonely place to be in when you're the only country who has been able to deal with it, because it's no fun being able to do this without sharing this with the rest of the world. We want international tourists to come here. And the message really from New Zealand is that even though our situations are different, I mean, we are an isolated country in the South Pacific, it can be done, but it needs to be a united response to COVID-19, if you put it that way. And everyone needs to get behind what the leader of a country has decided. I mean, you probably saw my post earlier about you need to decide between wealth and health. And you can't choose both at the same time, from what I've seen. And in New Zealand's case, Prime Minister Ardern said, you know what, we're going to choose health because we can't afford to see our fellow Kiwis die by the thousands because we are choosing to, not lock down and see if we can get what they call herd immunity. So a choice needs to be made, but everyone needs to get behind that choice. I mean, you can question it all you want, but we all need to get behind a common goal. Otherwise, you see what's happening even to other first world countries who have chosen to go half-hearted or halfway in responding to COVID, that they now have a very bad second wave. And we were close to actually reopening with Australia, but they now are facing a very bad case of the second wave of this crisis. And we are really hoping and praying that we will be able to get through it, because it's so easy for this virus to explode in the community. It's so contagious.
You know what? The human experiment rages on. This 200 or so thousand-year experiment has brought us to the best of times in the history of our species, according to Steven Pinker in his book, Better Angels. But there's always a few of us, a few nations that have it even better, that are slightly better than the way we are doing things where we are, than the rest of us. Although we are divided by, waters, and we are different in so many ways in terms of our socio-economic standing, our economy of the nation, the landscape of the country, and all that stuff. We share the same longings, the same desires, the same need to belong, the same need to love. We share the same humanity. And I think it's necessary that we learn from each other, right, Raul?
Yes, yes, that's true.
Take advantage of the super highway, information superhighway. Talk to people like Raul to build even better societies, better nations that we can be proud of and our children can be proud of, and so on and so forth. Raoul Alo, thank you so much for taking time off. I know it's the middle of the night over there in New Zealand, and yet you still did this interview. Thank you so much. And I hope that our viewers, especially here in Cebu, who are still slugging it out um, uh, with the pandemic and all that stuff, hopefully will learn a thing or two from this interview and from you and from the way New Zealand is. Thank you so much, Raul.
Thank you, Jiggy. And rest assured, Cebu and the rest of the country are in our prayers every day. And we will get through this.
Thank you, Raul.